Shalom lekulam. Good evening to everybody. This week, I decided to surprise everybody, including to some extent myself, and probably even to a larger extent, Gavriel Martindale. It was my idea and my suggestion. Gavriel will be giving a Shiur this evening on Parashat Parah, or a certain aspect of Parashat Parah, a very interesting and complicated Halachic aspect of this mitzvah of Parah Adumah. And Gavriel, who is a true scholar, has, I think, discovered some very meaningful hidushim on this topic. So, without further ado, b'chavod rav, yedidenu, mechubadenu, Gavriel Martindale.
Thank you very much to the Rav. Obviously, not only would this Shiur not be taking place if it wasn't for the Rav starting the first ever series of Shiurim on the original Eretz Yisrael way of reading the Torah in roughly 3 years, but also the Shiur wouldn't be taking place because if it wasn't for the Rav and his teachings, which I discovered, Baruch Hashem, nearly a decade ago, I wouldn't have done the learning that went towards making this Shiur. Okay, so let's start. Very basics to start with. Parashat Parah is the third of the Arba Parshioth, which, according to the original practice, as specified in the Mishnah, are supposed to completely interrupt the ordinary cycle of readings, so that wherever you're up to in the Torah, and in this, on the Machon Shilo cycle, we're up to, I think, Sidra Shesh, the sixth Sidra of Shemoth. But wherever you happen to be up to, you stop and you read special Parshioth that are specific to this time of year, that we have to read because they have particular topical relevance. So what is the topical relevance of Parashat Parah? So to understand that, is the easiest way to think about it is, well, what's the next week's Parsha? Next week's Parsha is Parashat Chodesh. Parashat Chodesh tells you about the various details of the Korban Pesach, that it has to be a lamb or a goat, it has to be in its first year, it has to be unblemished, v'chuli. And why do you need to learn that? You need to learn that because Pesach is coming up, and you need to prepare. You need to prepare your Korban Pesach. And so why do we learn Parashat Parah? Because before you can prepare your Korban Pesach, there's something that has to happen 7 days before the Korban Pesach, at least, which is that you have to become tahor metumas meth. So to become tahor, to bring your Korban Pesach, there are various different forms of tumah, and most of them, the process involves immersing in water, in certain cases immersing in a spring, waiting a particular period of time prior to that, and in some cases bringing also a korban. However, tumas meth, the most severe form of tumah, which you can contract by touching a dead human body or a part of it, or something that has touched a dead human body, can only be removed by having sprinkled upon you what we call mei hadath, or the Torah calls mei nidah, which are water which has had added to it in a particular process, ashes made from the Parah Adumah. And so, therefore, in order to remind us of the inyan of Tahara before bringing the Korban Pesach, which is something that is machayev the whole of Am Yisrael, we have Parashat Parah now, a week before Parashat Chodesh. And Parashat Parah describes the whole process of making the mechatath. You start with a female cow that's completely red, that's never done any work. It has to be shechted in a particular place, in a particular way. It has to be burnt, the ashes have to be collected, etc., and then they have to be added to water, and then there's a sprinkling process. And the whole process can be learned by studying this parsha and the halachot, of which there are huge amounts that are derived from it. So that's the basic inyan of Parashat Parah. However, there is a second inyan which is developed for Parashat Parah, which has a root in Chazal, but really took off in the post-Chazalic period, which is to see Parashat Parah as the time when we really emphasize a point, which is that not everything in Judaism, not everything in the Torah has to make sense. And in fact, there are some things in the Torah that simply do not make sense, that are illogical, or you might say appear illogical, that only Hashem, the creator of the universe, who has infinite wisdom, infinite understanding of the creation he made, only a Kadosh Baruch Hu can understand these things. And so what are called the Yosroth, the liturgical poems that were traditionally associated with Parashat Parah, nowadays mostly only said in Chutz La'aretz, certainly more said in Chutz La'aretz than in Eretz Yisrael, mostly said by Hasidim or Yekers or traditional Hungarians. If you look at the text of these Yosroth, they emphasize at great length, with great poetry and elaboration, the irrationality of this mitzvah, or more accurately, I should say, the incomprehensibility of this mitzvah. It's something that is beyond human comprehension. So you say, well, what is it exactly about Parah Adumah that is so beyond human comprehension? So you could just say, really, it's the whole thing. Why a cow? Why a red cow? Why does it have to be ash? Why does the ash have to have a piece of cedar wood and a piece of scarlet thread and some hyssop? What does the whole thing, you could say, is just defies human comprehension. However, what is really focused on in these Yosroth and in the subsequent tradition and in Drashoth that are given every year for Parashat Parah, written or spoken, is the paradox contained in the fact, which is made explicit in the Torah itself, which is that the Mechatath, the Parah Adumah, is simultaneously the most powerful tool we have for the creation of Tahara. It's the only thing that can remove the most severe form of Tumah, which is Tumath Meth. But at the very same time, it's something that creates Tumah. So if you are Tamei Meth, the only way you can remove that Tumah from yourself, the only way you can become Tahor, is through these Mechatath. But at the same time, every single person who was involved in the creation of these Mechatath, the person who shechted the cow, the Kohen who shechted the cow, who burnt the cow, who collected the ashes, they all become Tamei. So the concept that it's Matamei et Tameim, Mataher et Mataher et Tameim and Matamei et Torim, is central to this concept that the Parah Adumah is the focus point of incomprehensibility in Torah. So therefore, if you were to ask someone, and I recommend you could just do it next week in shul after the laning, if you live in a place where you're allowed to go to shul, you should say, what happens to the person, the Kohen who sprinkles the Mechatath? Is he Tamei afterwards or is he Tahor afterwards? And I think you'll find that the vast majority of people will tell you he's Tamei, because that's what the Mechatath do. They are Mataher et Tameim, Matamei et Torim. So if he was Tahor at the start, he's going to have to be Tamei now. And it's not just it makes sense because there's a general concept which is Mechatath are Matamei Tohorim, but also, and now I'm going to start looking at the source sheet. I'll share it on my screen. But for those who have it themselves, it's source 1. It's also, as it happens, and this is not an inconsiderable point, it's what the Pasuk says quite explicitly. So, most of Parashat Parah, Pasuk 21, says, it will be for them an eternal statute. And the one who sprinkles the Meinidah, the Mechatath, shall wash his clothes. We'll explain later what the significance is of washing his clothes, as opposed to just saying he's Tamei. That will become clear later. But Al Kol Panim, we see that the Torah says very explicitly he's Tamei. And also the person who touches him. The person who touches them, the person who sprinkles them, the pasuk seems to say, as clear as you could possibly have it, they are both tamei. So there's what to lean on, you might think, for those who say, as most people I think will say, that the mazeh, the sprinkler, is tamei afterwards. However, if we look at Rashi, and of course officially everyone's supposed to read Rashi every week on the Parsha, he says, this is now source 2, as clear as you could possibly have it. Our rabbi said that the mazeh, the one who sprinkles, is tahor. Now, I think it's probably just worth just taking a second to say, this is, on the face of it, kind of a remarkable statement. We just read, the Torah says, it's hard to say, how could the Torah have been more explicit that the mazeh is tamei? And then Rabboseinu, Chazal, the rabbis that we have to follow, from whom we receive the Torah Sheb'al Peh, which is really the whole Torah as it is a applied system, they tell us precisely the opposite. And if we scroll down to source 3, we see that the Rambam says exactly the same thing. So, Halachic here, he says, if there's enough water for one to sprinkle with, there's a minimum shiur. This in itself is a complicated topic, but there's a minimum shiur. That's all we need to know for right now. There's a minimum shiur that you need to have in the keli, in the bowl, in order to sprinkle on someone. If that minimum shiur is there, matamaim b'maga uv'masa. Matame in maga, that is to say, you touch them with your finger or any other part of your body. Uv'masa. Masa means lifting, which is to say that even if you don't touch them, don't touch the water itself at all, but you lift up a vessel in which the water is, that act of lifting it up, or even moving it side to side or whatever, makes you tamei. And those are the two principal ways in which Tumah is transmitted. Okay, Rambam continues. Like we saw from the pasuk, one touches them, he doesn't just become tamei, he also is matame his clothes at that very second. The tumah passes through him to his clothes. Now, what does that can you hear me now? Josh? Can you hear me?
Now I can, yes.
Okay. So how long was I breaking up?
No, it was just on and off for a few minutes. Maybe you weren't speaking directly into the speaker. I don't know.
Okay, so is it better now? It's fine now?
Now it's very good.
Okay, so what does it mean to say that the tumah passes through you to your clothes? Well, there's basically two things that can happen when a person becomes tamei. So let's say I touch a dead person. A dead person is an avi avos l'tumah. I touch him and I become an av l'tumah. And av l'tumah means that anything that touches me now becomes a rishon l'tumah. My clothes are touching me, therefore they become tamei. That's one thing that can happen. The other thing that can happen, if say I touch a dead gecko or mouse or whatever, the dead gecko itself is an av l'tumah, and I become a rishon l'tumah. Therefore, since I myself am a rishon l'tumah, I can't make anything else anything more than a sheni l'tumah. And the only things that could become sheni l'tumah is food. So if I now touch an apple, that apple becomes tamei, but my clothes that are on me do not become tamei at all. I have no ability to pass tumah onto them. So the Rambam says, someone who touches, someone who lifts up even without touching mechadas, becomes tamei, he becomes an av l'tumah with the ability to make his own clothes tamei. And then he says here, Shne'ema umazeh mehanida yichabes the pasuk that we just saw, that the sprinkler of the meinida, of these things, has to wash his clothes. Well, what's the sprinkler got to do with the person who touched it or with the noseh? See, It's not talking, the pasuk is not talking about the mazeh at all. Rambam says, it's a very logical point. If mechatath, when they're sprinkled upon you as a tameh person, make you tahor, you, the sprinkler, can't possibly become tameh from it. It just makes no sense. What the Rambam saying is, all these droshes you've heard about how, which may be wrong, about how the mazeh, the sprinkler, becomes tameh, and it doesn't make any sense. The Rambam is saying, you're right, it doesn't make any sense, and that's why it's not true. Okay, and the Rambam continues, from a Kabbalah, an oral tradition, learn that the sprinkling, that the words that lechora seem to be talking about the one who sprinkles the menidah, lo ne'emar ela l'shiur. They're not said to tell us. They don't tell us anything about the sprinkler. They tell us that if you touch it or if you lift it, it only makes you tameh if there was a shiur of hazaya. And that's what Rashi says here above in source 2. Our rabbis say that the mazeh is tahor, the sprinkler is tahor. So what about these words that say as explicitly as you would think could be said that he's tameh? This is not, you may have noticed it's not quite exactly what the Rambam said, but the point is, again in Rashi, the only purpose, again, not an additional purpose, the only purpose of the Torah using this lashon of mazeh, of a sprinkler, is to tell you something not about the mazeh at all, about the nogea, the toucher, or the noseh, the lifter, that they become tameh, or they reach a certain level of tumah according to Rashi, only if there is shiur hazaya, if there is enough mechatath, if the waters of the Parah Adumah are there in sufficient quantity that you would be able to fulfill the mitzvah of sprinkling with them. Okay? Now, the next two sources I brought are not sources, they're just examples of things I found on the internet where people basically, not people, Rabbanim, certainly at least in the first case, Rav Yitzchak Twersky, who I respect very much, and I recommend his Shiurim, who basically debunk the common misconception that the mazeh is tahor. They say, look, it's mafurish Rashi, it's mafurish Gemara, we're going to see, and really something's very wrong if you think that the mazeh is tahor, because why didn't you manage to get to the Rashi on Pasuk 20? Okay. In this Shiur, what I want to say, basically, is that actually the Poshet Yid, the one who didn't get round to learning Rashi, and doesn't know that the mazeh is tahor, and just read the Pasuk and said, well, it says the mazeh is tameh, so the mazeh is tameh, actually is correct. And there are three kind of programmatic points that I want to make, and I'll try and illustrate them in the rest of the shiur. So the first thing is that unfortunately today, it's not always the case, as it certainly should be the case, that the more Torah you learn, the closer you come to fulfilling Ratzon Hashem, the closer you come to being Mekayim the Torah. Unfortunately, it's often the case that the more you learn, the more mistakes you make. So a very good example, one that's important to Machon Shilo, is Kazayeth. So a simple Jew, he sees that, right, it says, I need to eat a kazayeth of masa on Pesach on Seder night. Okay, well, kazayeth means kazayeth, like an olive. An olive is, say, yay big. Okay, so I take some matzah that's yay big, and I eat it. And then if I want to eat more, I eat more, but I'm already yotze. Okay? However, a Jew who went to yeshiva, and he comes to this Seder and he says, no, you got it all wrong. You don't understand. The size of a kazayeth is a machloikus. The Rambam holds that it's a third of the size of an egg. Rambam says no such thing, it's just invented, but whatever. And the Re holds that it's half the size of an egg. That is the case. And because it's a Doraisa, we have to be Machmir like the more Machmir Shitta. So we have to say Kazayas, at least for math's purpose, is half the size of an egg. Okay. And the Noida Behuda says that eggs have got smaller. So half an egg for Chazal is an egg for us. And there are also other poskim who, for reasons that are not entirely clear, say you can't measure the volume because it's too hard or something. You have to measure the weight of an egg, and matzah is not very heavy. And then the Shulchan Aruch says, L'chachila, you should eat 2 kazaysim at the same time. So you end up with people shoveling an enormous amount of matzah in their face at the Seder night because of what they've learned. And the truth is, they're just wrong. The simple Yid who said, kazayit means like an olive, so I just take an olive, was right all along. And that's a simple example. But there are lots of examples. Ronald Reagan once said, the problem with our liberal friends is not that they don't know anything, it's that they know so many things that are just not true. And unfortunately, that's the problem with a lot of Judaism today. It's not that people don't know, it's that they learn things that they could definitely know, that unfortunately it would be better had they not learned at all. Obviously, if you take it to the next step and you go beyond, then that's best. Unfortunately, the truth is you can't really say otherwise. What's better, learning the wrong thing about a kazayit, or never having learned anything at all and just doing what any ordinary person would say upon reading the word kazayit? That's point number 1. Point number 2, programmatic, that I want to make, is that often people will say, your Havana of this pasuk, or your Havana of what makes sense, tells you this, but you have to follow Chazal. You have to be mevatel your das to Chazal. Okay? Now, if we take that statement literally, that's 100% true. If you think a pasuk means something and Chazal says it means something else, you can try to understand what Chazal mean, but the bottom line is you have to do what Chazal say. You don't understand the Torah better than Chazal. However, the fact is, a lot of the time when people say, Chazal say this, you have to be mevatel your das to Chazal, what they mean is, it says here in the Bavli, in the Stama'itic layer, this, and the Mishnah says completely different thing, and the Yerushalmi says different, and Tosefta says different, and Sifrei says different, but you have to, for some reason, you have to do what Chazal say, and by Chazal, I mean the Bavli, okay? And we're going to see that at the end of this Shiur, we're going to see that the truth of the matter can only be found by going outside the Bavli and reading the Sifrei, a source that's just not part of the standard yeshiva curriculum at all. And again, it's often important when someone says, you have to say this, Chazal say this, and even though you can't understand it, you just have to accept it. It's worth checking, and sometimes checking requires a lot of work. I mean, is that true? Is this in fact what Chazal, the whole of Chazal, actually say? And the third point that I want to illustrate is about the nature of drash. So every Jew, every observant halachic Jew, has to accept that there is information, halachic information in Pesukim, that you wouldn't be able to get just by reading them with the laws of dikduk and kind of what we might say ordinary reading. They have to be extracted through Chazal's exegetical rules, klal, uprat, etc., etc. Okay? But after that, there's 2 ways you can go. One way is to say, yes, just what I said. Another way is to extend that and to say, therefore, Pashat in Torah doesn't really exist. What the Torah says, the sentences in there, it's not really important, because really it's just a code for you to extract drashot from. That the Pashat doesn't mean anything. The Pashat is completely mevutal. And I once was told this explicitly by a Jew, someone I respect, someone who helped me a lot at a certain stage of my life. He told me, he said, to sit down and read the Torah like a book and to think about what Pesukim mean without first going to Rashi, that's what a Christian does. That's not what a Jew does. That Pashat, there is no Pashat. Pashat doesn't exist. And that's not obviously what you would think from reading the medieval Rishonim, Ramban, Ibn Ezra on the Torah. And also I don't think it's the most reasonable way of approaching things. And I think we're going to see here, what I'm going to try and show is an example of here where in one place, in the Bavli, Drash removes Pashat, and another place Drash builds on Pashat, but the Pashat Omed Bimkomo. Okay, so we're going to move on, and we're going to look at Rashi and Rambam's source for this halacha of Hamazet Tahor, which is in the Bavli in two places, in Masechet Yoma and in Masechet Nida. I'm only going to look here at Masechet Yoma. However, I've included Masechet Nida, which in a different context, it basically says the same thing for people to look at. So I'm going to read Masechet Yoma, the lines in bold here. Okay. Well, I'm actually going to read one word before the line in bold. Tanya. There's a braisa that says, "Wehizah hatahor ala tamei, tahor, wala tahor tamei." Divrei Rabbi Akiva. Okay. The first few words are a quote from an earlier pasuk where it says the tahor, the person who is tahor, will sprinkle upon the tamei. And Rabbi Akiva learns from this a very interesting halacha. It's not halacha because the Chachamim reject it, but it's an interesting idea, which is that the mechatath, which have the koach to be matahir someone who is tamei meth, if you sprinkle them on someone who's already tahor, he becomes tamei. But basically, they work by opposites. They're not so much an instrument for creating tahara, they're an instrument for flipping. Whatever state you were in before, now you're the opposite. This is Rabbi Akiva's view of the mechatath. Now, there's lots of halachic nafkaminas here, and the context of this sugya in Yom is as follows. For 7 days before Yom Kippur, the Kohen Gadol is sequestered in a room to prepare him for the avodah of Yom Kippur, and also to stop him from becoming tamei. And one of the things they would do is every day they would sprinkle him with mechatath. Why? Well, why not? The point is, we don't, as far as we know, he's tahor, but it's possible he's tamei. Yom Kippur is a very important thing, and just to make sure, we're gonna keep sprinkling with mechatath to make sure he's tahor. Okay, because it would be a terrible thing for him to go into the Kodesh Kodashim tamei. But according to Rabbi Akiva, that's a disastrous idea. You literally cannot do that, because what would you achieve if you took a Kohen Gadol who was tahor, and then you made him, and then you sprinkled the mechatath? You would make him tamei. So there's whether or not this claim is true is extremely important. And the end of the braisa is because we only have half an hour left, I won't explain exactly what that means. But the point is, the Chachamim reject that view. They have a different explanation of the pasuk in question, and the Chachamim's view is mechatath make you tahor, and if you're already tahor, well, they don't do anything, but they don't make you tamei. Okay, so then we continue to the second part, which I bolded. And now it's very important to understand here. This is the Gemara explaining the machloketh between Rabbi Akiva and the Chachamim. This is not Rabbi Akiva talking, and this is not the Chachamim talking. This is the Stama-itic Lehr explaining the Fi Da'atam, the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and the opinion of the Chachamim. And that is not, it's certainly not always the case that this is actually Rabbi Akiva's view. Certainly not the case this is actually Rabbi Akiva's words. And there are plenty of occasions when you can find an example where the Stam in the Bavli will explain a machloketh of the Tanaim or even of the Amoraim a particular way, and the Yerushalmi will say something completely different. It will explain it completely differently. And if it was the case Bavli had an absolute masorah that this is what these Tanaim really said and really thought, then the Yerushalmi wouldn't say something different. So this is what the Stama-itic Lehr says here. Okay, explaining Rabbi Akiva's view. Rabbi Akiva hainu deka'ama Shlomo. Shlomo Melech says in Koheleth, he says, Amati ahachma v'hi rechoka mimeni. There's a pasuk in Koheleth that says, I engaged in wisdom, but it was too far from me. There was something that I, Shlomo Melech, the wisest man who ever lived, who understands more Torah than any man, there was something that was still beyond my comprehension. Okay? What is that thing that was beyond their comprehension? They're saying, Rabbi Akiva says, therefore there must be something in Parah Adumah that is just completely inexplicable. That is completely inexplicable. Okay? What is this thing that's completely inexplicable? The fact that it flips you. That's how, again, remember, that's how Rabbi Akiva understands Mechataf. That whatever you were before, once it's been sprinkled on you, now do the opposite. If you were Tameh, you're Tahor, and if you were Tamor, you're Tameh. Okay? And this is something in Parah Adumah, in the halachos of Parah Adumah, that is inexplicable. Now, how does the Stam go on here? The Stam says, okay, well, how do the Chachamim who reject this concept explain this pasuk? Now, no, you could just say, well, they don't make a drasha on this pasuk at all. Okay, but that's not the rules of how the Stam approaches this. The rule of how a Stam approaches a machlokes like this is each side has to be able to explain all the different ra'ayos of the other side. Okay, because otherwise, well, they're just wrong, aren't they? So unless every single pasuk that one side brings in support of their argument, the other side has to have some way of explaining what they mean that doesn't entail that. Okay. So therefore, what the Chachamim have to have something in the halachos of Parah Adumah that doesn't make any sense, that is completely inexplicable, that Shlomo HaMelech, with all his chokhmah, could not understand. There has to be something, but not this, because they don't hold of this. Okay, Warabanan hahu lamazeh ulamazin alau tahor wa nogeh behem tameh. The Chachamim say, what is the din of Parah Adumah that is inexplicable, that cannot be understood by mortal man? It's that the one, if you just go to the mechatas and you stick your finger in, you're tameh. But if you get it sprinkled on your head in the right way, you're tahor. And the person who sprinkles it is tahor. Okay? That's the thing that's inexplicable. Notice, by the way, before the Rambam Zal, this is basically the opposite of what the Rambam said. The Rambam said that the mazeh is tahor because it's just obvious. It's kol v'chomer, the mazeh has to be tahor. It's logic. If the person it's sprinkled on is tahor, then the person who's sprinkling is also tahor. Whereas here, Chazal say, no. The Stam says, the reason why we're telling you the mazeh is tahor, because we have to find something, according to the Chachamim, in Parah Adumah, that is incomprehensible. Okay? Now, what's the problem with this? The Gemara says, mazeh tahor? What do you mean? You just told me, according to the Chachamim, what is the thing in Parah Adumah that is incomprehensible? It's that the mazeh is tahor. Okay, fine, I agree it's incomprehensible. Let's say I agree it's incomprehensible. The Rambam didn't think it was incomprehensible. He thought it was entirely comprehensible. But let's say it's incomprehensible. Well, there's a more obvious one. Wait a second. The Pasuk just tells you, just what we learned at the beginning. The Pasuk tells you the mazeh is tameh. Not just tameh, by the way. The mazeh is tameh, metameh begadim. What it means to say is, not just does he contract tumah, he contracts tumah sufficiently strong that he can pass it onto his clothes. That is to say, he becomes an avla tumah. Okay? So the Gemara continues. My mazeh nogea. Well, what does it just say? It says the word mazeh means nogea. It doesn't mean the one who sprinkles, it means the one who touches it. Okay, and the Gemara then says the most obvious response that I think anyone here also had. V'hakasiv mazeh. It doesn't say nogea, it says mazeh. Why are you telling me it means nogea when it says mazeh? If the Torah wants to tell you something about a nogea, it will say nogea. The word nogea comes up dozens of times in Torah relating to Tara and Tumah. So just say it. But not just that. It's not just that. Remember, if you go back to the Pasuk, I'll scroll up. The Pasuk talked about two separate categories of people. It says that the mazeh has to be mechabes begadim, that is, he's a rish avlatuma, and the nogea, the one who touches it, doesn't. So it's not just that it's a bit schwer to say that mazeh means nogea when they're two different things. It's that the pasuk explicitly makes a difference between mazeh and nogea, and now you're trying to tell me that mazeh means nogea. Okay? Right. So the Gemara says, Elamai. The Gemara says, Elamai. Okay, so what does it then mean? Noseh. The Gemara is talking about, the pasuk, when it says mazeh, we tried nogea, that didn't work. Okay? So it means noseh. It means the one who not touches, the one who lifts. Okay? So then the Gemara says the exact same question we asked on the first perush. If it means noseh, if it means lift, the lifter, then say the lifter. Again, it's not like the Torah is incapable of saying lifter. The Torah can say lifter. There's noseh. If it says mazeh, there must be a reason for it saying mazeh. Okay. But then the Gemara has one for this. It says mazeh to teach you something. Mazeh means noseh, i.e. sprinkler means carrier, but it comes to teach you that one who lifts up only becomes tameh, to be matame begadim, if there's enough water in this vessel, mechataf in this vessel, to perform the mitzvah of hazah. Okay? Now, what has the Gemara done here? The Gemara has said, I can explain why it uses the word mazeh, to teach you something about a noseh. And therefore, the pashat of the pasuk, that a mazeh is tamei, and he has to be machabes begadim, doesn't exist. It's gone. Those words that you read in front of your eyes in this pasuk have no halachic reality at all. They simply don't exist for practical Torah purposes. Their only purpose is you can use them through physical rules to learn something about the noseh. But the pashat of the pasuk is mavutal. Okay? Now, second thing to notice about this Gemara is, how was this idea of hamazeh tahor introduced? Well, we had to say there's something in the halachoth of mechatas that is incomprehensible. And what is it? It's the concept of hamazeh tahor, whereas nogea tameh. The sprinkler is tahor, but the one who touches it is tameh. That's incomprehensible. How does the Gemara know that the mazeh is tahor? Well, it's not because the posuk said so. That's a problem. It has to try and explain the posuk another way. Is it because the Mishnah says so? No. Is it because the Tosefta says so? No. Is it because any prior source says so? No. So how does the Gemara know this? Well, I don't know the answer to that question. But the point is, the Gemara knows it from somewhere, and then, far from learning it out from the pasuk, it has to find a way of explaining the pasuk that's compatible with this. And note, it's clearly not the case, like the Rambam Zal suggested, that this is learned mipi hashemua, that it's a Kabbalah that goes back ben achaben, per achaper from Sinai. Because it tried out that maybe mazeh means nogea, and then it decided, well, that can't work. Okay, so mazeh means noseh. Well, if you know mipi Kabbalah, the perush of mazeh is noseh, why even bother with that whole line? Maybe it means nogea. Oh, but it can't. Okay? So, I think in cases like this, when you see something that's where those two issues that present themselves, number one, that the Bavli knows something that we know from no prior source, that Lechora is very hard to accept, A, and B, it clearly doesn't know it from some sort of received tradition, because it only arrives at it after some pilpul, it's very reasonable to ask yourself, well, is this actually true? And that's where we come to our final source. Again, I'm going to skip Nida. You'll see it's introduced, formally speaking, the sugya is identical. In terms of how the argument progresses, it's introduced for a completely different topic, but it doesn't make a difference right now for our purpose. We're going to go to Sifrei Bamidbar. So what is Sifrei, first of all? Sifrei is the Halachic Midrash that we have, that survived and was passed down on Sefer Bamidbar. That's not to say it's the only Halachic Midrash compilation that was composed, but it's the one that was passed down. And what is the job of Sifrei and all of the Halachic Midrash? It's to connect the Mishnah, basically. It's to connect Torah Sheb'al Peh with Pesukim, with the Torah Shebichtav. Now, when exactly Sifrei was composed and recorded is itself a vexed question that I won't go into, but it's sometime around the Mishnah, before and after. Okay. Now let's look at what the Sifrei says here. Okay. First of all, it quotes the part of the pasuk we're dealing with. The one who sprinkles a meinida has to wash his clothes. That is to say, he is tamei, his clothes are tamei. Okay? Now, before we move on, two things. First of all, let's just look at these bolded words, okay? We're going to learn this whole source because it's very important to really understand what it's saying. But let's just look at these bolded words. Uma imamazeh she'en nogea matamei begadim. And it goes on, Hamazeh nogea din hu shiyit ma begadim. It's going to learn, and we'll see exactly how it learns. It learns a kol v'chomer. But what does it say? Ama'im, if the mazeh who doesn't touch is matame begadim, then we learn something else, kol v'chomer. I.e., the very thing that the Bavli just told you is not true, that the mazeh is tamei, the Sifrei takes as a premise. It says it's so obviously true. Why is it obviously true? Because the pasuk says so. It's so obviously true that we can learn things from it. We can use it as a building block to learn further concepts. Okay? Now, I'm going to go back to the pasuk and just learn what would be Peshat, so we can understand what the Sifrei is doing with this and the drasha that it adds on to the Peshat. Okay? What is Peshat? The sprinkler has to wash his clothes. Okay, what does it mean a sprinkler has to wash his clothes? Like I said before, it means not just he becomes tamei, but his clothes become tamei. What does that mean? It means he becomes an avlatuma, okay? Capable of making other things, including his clothes, rishon l'tumah. But the one who merely touches it, he dunks his finger or his elbow or whatever into the meichatath, it doesn't say he has to wash his clothes. It just says he becomes tamei until the evening. Lechora what? It means he becomes tamei, but his clothes are not tamei. I.e., he is only a rishon l'tumah. That is the pashat in the pasuk that you would, if you understand the basic categories of tuma and tahara, you would learn from this pasuk prior to any drashot. That is making a chiluk between the mazeh and the nogea, between the sprinkler and the toucher, and therefore, what chiluk? That the sprinkler gets a higher level of tumah than the toucher. And that's the kind of baseline assumption of what you would think from the Peshat of the pasuk. And now we're going to see what Sifrei does with that. Okay, so we're starting here. Ben mayim lamayim. Ben mayim lamayim hakathuv medaber. The water, the pasuk, the kathuv, the pasuk is talking about two categories of water. וחילק הכתוב בין מים שיש בהם כדי הזיה ובין מים שאין בהם כדי הזיה. The pasuk distinguishes, it makes a division between water that has sufficient quantity to perform the mitzvah of sprinkling and water that does not have the minimum shiur for doing sprinkling. Okay, what's the distinction? Shahamayim sheyesh behem kedei hazaya matamei adam letamei begadim. Water that has got the shiur sprinkling is matamei a person to be matamei clothes. What does that mean? Again, it means he becomes an avatumah. Umayim she'en behen kedei hazaya matamei adam letamei ochalim umashkim. However, water that is below the minimum quantity to perform the mitzvah, if you touch it, you are only matame food and drink, which means what? You are a rishon l'tumah. You cannot be matame clothes, because clothes cannot become sheni l'tumah. The only things that can become sheni l'tumah are food and drink, and therefore the only thing you can be matame is food and drink. So if there's the minimum shiur, you're an av l'tumah, and if there's not the minimum shiur, you're a rishon l'tumah. Okay. And then the Sifrei asks that. Okay, that's an argument. Maybe it means something else. And then it doesn't actually spell out the rest of it, whereas the nogea doesn't. So maybe it just means, like the Pashat we learned before, a mazeh, one who actually performs a sprinkling, becomes an av l'tumah, and a nogea becomes a rishon l'tumah. Okay? But then it says, "Hamazeh nogea dinhu sheyit ma'agadim." What about one who sprinkles and touches? Isn't it logical that in such a case he should become an av l'tumah to be matame begadim? Why? It's kavachoma. It's obvious. If someone who sprinkles it and he doesn't even touch it is matame begadim, he is an av l'tumah. Hamazeh nogea dinhu sheyit begadim. One who actually touches it, kavachoma, he should be matame begadim. He should become an av l'tumah. Now, I don't want to make too many diukim on the Girsa here. I just copied this from Sefaria today, and I didn't have time to consult Finkelstein. I think that some of these words, I think that there's some small Girsa issues here. And it's always a very important thing before you are medayik on any source to make sure you're not being medayik on a copyist error, which unfortunately has happened, not infrequently. But the point is here, let's look. What is the Sifrei telling you? The Sifrei is telling you there is a drasha. What is a drasha? It's similar to the one in the Bavli, but it's not identical. The drasha is, there is a chiluk, there is a distinction. There is a distinction in the din of a toucher, of a nogea, between whether there is sufficient water to do hazaya, there is shiur hazaya, there is a minimum shiur of this mechatas, or if there's not. If there is the minimum shiur, then he becomes an av l'tumah. And if there isn't the minimum shiur, then he becomes a rishon l'tumah. Okay? Now, that drush is not the same as the one the Bavli brought about the noseh, but it's generically similar. And by the way, it's not contradictory. Both of them are lichora, the halacha. But here's the key distinction between what the Sifrei does with its drasha and what the Bavli does with its drasha. The Bavli says, this is the drasha on the word mazeh, and therefore the pashat of the word mazeh doesn't exist. The mazeh is tahur. The Sifrei is saying, the first thing this pasuk teaches you is that the mazeh, the sprinkler, is tamei, as an av l'tumah. And we also learn from exegesis, from applying our rules of exegesis to this pasuk, that there's an extra thing that you wouldn't necessarily know just from stam reading the pasuk, that the nogea, the toucher, is if there's not the minimum shiur, he is an Rishon L'Tumah. And if there is the Min Mashiach, he is an Av L'Tumah. Whereas just from the pasuk itself, again, remember, you might have thought that the one who touches it, in all cases, regardless, is always going to be just a Rishon L'Tumah. Whereas the Drasha in the Sifrei told you that that's only if there's not the Shiur. If there is the Shiur, then he's actually an Av L'Tumah, just like the sprinkler himself. So here, the Drasha and the Peshat are basically in harmony. The Drasha builds on the Peshat. The Peshat is true, and the Drasha adds something extra. The Drasha adds more detail to the halachic picture. And this is what the Drasha does, that without these exegetical rules of Kol V'chomer, in this case, and I think there's also a bit of Hekesh, we wouldn't know all the halachos. But the basic understanding of the Pasuk is still true. The Mazeh is still definitely Tameh. There's no doubt that the Mazeh is Tameh, because the Pasuk tells you so explicitly in as many words. Whereas, what did the Bavli say? The Bavli said, once I've got a drasha, I can now throw the Peshat in the bin. The Peshat doesn't even exist anymore. The Torah says, Hamazeh me nida yechabes begadav, but that's just not what it means, because it doesn't mean that. It means whatever my drasha just said. Whereas the Sifrei said, the Torah, the Peshat, omed bin komo, and the drasha helps us build a more complete halachic picture, which is what you need in order to have a complete halachic system. So, to kind of sum up what I said before, number one, the Poshet Yid who thought that Mazeh me nida yachapes begadav, that the Mazeh is tamei, just like the Torah says, and he didn't get around to reading Rashi, so we never learned that he was wrong. In fact, he was right after all. Okay? That's number one. Number two, that even someone I respect very much, like Rav Yitzhak Twersky, unfortunately, I have to say here, he wrote an article condemning, again, mildly, but saying that people are wrong, people believe something wrong, they haven't learned Rashi and therefore they're wrong. And unfortunately, he's wrong and they're right. And therefore, what does this teach us? That before making a decision about an issue, it's not enough just to learn the Bavli. It's not enough just to learn Rashi. If you haven't checked what the Sifrei said, or the Sifra, or the Mechilta, whatever, you can't be sure that you're actually right. And the third thing is that this concept that drush is something that just eliminates Peshat, that it just, if you can just remove Peshat through drush, which is a concept that I think a lot of people hold, and a lot of people think they should hold, and it causes them a lot of trouble, it causes them a lot of spiritual distress, it's there. It seems to be there in this Stamei Itik in the Bavli, but it's not the only view of Chazal. And there's no reason even to think that it's actually kind of the dominant view or the overwhelming view of Chazal. The Sifrei says, if the Torah says something, it's true. It's obviously true, and we can make kol v'chomers from it being true. And there are drashot as well. But those drashot don't abolish the Peshat. And so I think that this is this whole sugya, which I hope that I've explained competently, is an important one to learn, like many other sugyos, to help us develop a more balanced and reasonable relationship with Yiddishkeit. And I will leave off there. If anyone has questions or comments.
I do not have a question, but I have a comment, if I may. And that is that I think, Gavriel, you have done a wonderful, exceptional job of expounding this topic. And I just want to say, Bemet, I'm very impressed. Hazak uvaruch.
Thank you very much, Harav. Thank you very much, Gavriel.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.